The young filly stood alone near the far end of the dusty sale yard, her ribs showing through a thin layer of coat that looked like it hadn't been brushed in months. Buyers walked past her without slowing down, some shaking their heads, some muttering about how she wasn't worth the trouble. She lowered her head every time someone approached, as if expecting another harsh shove or another loud command. Most folks didn't even look twice. A weak young filly wasn't what anyone came for. Not when strong, trained horses filled the front pens, shining under the morning sun. But the cowboy who stopped in front of her didn't walk past. He didn't turn away. He stood quietly, studying her with a steady, thoughtful look that made the auction runner raise a brow. No one knew what made him pause there. Maybe it was the way the filly tried to hide her trembling legs, or maybe it was the defeated softness in her eyes. Whatever it was, something held his attention as he worked the brim of his hat between his fingers. He didn't say anything at first. He just watched her breathe, slow and shaky. People around him made quick judgments, whispering that he was wasting time, but he didn't react. A man who spent his life around horses could see details others missed. The filly was weak, yes, but there was something else. Something beneath the dirt and fear. The sale started up again, loud voices echoing across the yard. The cowboy looked down at his worn boots, then back at the filly. He had come for fencing tools and feed, not another responsibility. He reminded himself of that. The last thing he needed was a sickly young animal that might not even make it through the next season. But for reasons he couldn't explain, he couldn't walk away either. A tug settled deep inside him, quiet but firm, the kind that rarely steered him wrong. When the bidding for the filly began, barely anyone stepped forward. A few low offers came from the back, mostly out of habit, not interest. Even the runner sounded half asleep calling her lot. The cowboy didn't raise his hand until the last moment, when the final call was about to fall silent. His offer was small, barely more than the price of an old saddle strap. People turned, surprised he even bothered. The runner gave a half shrug and accepted it. Just like that, the weak young filly became his. Cold air brushed his face as he led her out through the side gate. The filly walked stiffly, her hooves dragging slightly. She flinched at every sound. He didn't try to pet her or force closeness. He simply held the rope lightly and gave her space. She needed calm, not pressure. The truth was, he didn't know what he had gotten himself into. He only knew that something about her felt important, like she held a story no one else had taken the time to hear. He loaded her carefully into his old trailer and glanced back once before closing the door. Her eyes met his for a heartbeat. There was fear in them, yes, but also a spark. A tiny, fragile spark that hinted she hadn't given up completely. That moment stayed with him during the long ride home. It lingered even as the wind picked up and the sky grew dim with streaks of approaching clouds. By the time he pulled into his ranch, he was already thinking of what he needed to do next. The barn had space. The feed room had enough oat mix to start her on a soft diet. He had blankets and an old stall he hadn't used in a while. Still, the weight of uncertainty pressed on him. The filly needed more than a stall and feed. She needed patience, care, and time, a lot of it. He wasn't sure if he had enough of any of those. The ranch dog trotted out to greet him, tail wagging, before stopping at the scent of the filly. The dog sniffed the air, ears raised, then barked once as if announcing her arrival to the quiet land around them. The cowboy walked to the trailer and opened the door slowly. The filly hesitated, unsure of this new place. Her legs shook again. He stepped aside, giving her room to decide on her own. She took a few steps, cautious and uncertain, until her hooves touched the ground outside. The barn lights glowed warm and soft in the early dusk. The cowboy led her inside, the dog following behind. Each sound of the barn made the filly jump, but she didn't pull against the rope. That was something. The cowboy opened the stall door and let her walk in. She paused in the doorway, sniffing the air, then entered fully, lowering her head as she explored the clean bedding. It wasn't much, but it was safe. He filled the bucket with fresh water and set out a small amount of feed. She approached it slowly, taking a few bites before backing away. He watched quietly, noticing every detail, from her breathing to her stance. Weakness showed in her frame, but possibility glimmered faintly beneath it. Whatever future she had, it was fragile right now, and he wasn't sure if he had brought home a blessing or a burden. Night settled over the ranch. Crickets called out from the fields, and coyotes far away added their voices to the wind. The cowboy leaned against the stall door for a long while before turning away. He wasn't the type to take chances he couldn't calculate, but this time he had acted on instinct alone. Maybe that was why unease rolled through him now. He didn't regret buying her, but he couldn't deny the feeling that her arrival would shift something in ways he couldn't yet see. As he walked toward the house, he looked back one more time. Through the gap in the wood, he saw the filly standing still, her head turned toward him. He wondered if she sensed the same strange pull, a sense that something bigger waited ahead, something neither of them could name. He closed the barn door gently, shutting out the night wind. The thought followed him all the way home. Sleep didn't come easily. He kept thinking about the sale yard, about the people who ignored her, about the reasons someone might have let a young filly get into such shape. Horses didn't get that weak on their own. Something in her past was tangled, maybe even troubling. He had seen marks on her legs that didn't look natural. He had noticed the way she froze when someone walked too quickly near her. Those weren't signs of simple neglect. They hinted at something deeper, something hidden. The next morning, before the sun fully rose, he returned to the barn. The filly stood quietly in the corner of the stall. Her ears twitched at the sound of his boots on the ground. He spoke softly as he approached, carrying a brush. She lifted her head slightly. For a moment, it looked like she might step back in fear, but she stayed where she was. That tiny bit of trust was enough for him to continue. He brushed her coat gently, careful not to touch any sore spots. Dust rose from her fur in small clouds. She didn't move except to shift her weight now and then. With each slow stroke, he felt more certain that he had made the right choice even if he didn't understand why yet. Something about her felt unfinished, as if she had a future that didn't match the state she was in now. As the barn doors opened to the rising light, a cool breeze swept through, carrying the smell of morning grass and open land. The filly lifted her head toward it, her ears turning forward. For the first time since he'd brought her here, she looked less afraid and more curious. The cowboy took note of that. It meant hope. Hope was sometimes the only thing that made a weak horse stand strong again. But just when he started feeling more sure about her future, something unexpected happened. He heard the sound of a truck on the road stopping near his gate. He wasn't expecting anyone this early. The engine cut off and a door opened. He stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on his jeans. The morning light made it hard to see who stood at the fence. A man he didn't recognize leaned against the gate, watching the barn with an expression that was a little too fixed, a little too intent. He called out, asking if the cowboy had recently bought a young filly at the sale. His tone wasn't friendly. It wasn't casual either. The cowboy felt something tighten in his chest. He didn't answer right away, and the stranger's eyes narrowed. He repeated the question, slower this time, like he already knew the answer. The cowboy stepped closer, not sure what trouble had followed him home, but sensing clearly that whatever path he had stepped onto with that weak filly was far from simple. And as the morning light spread across the ranch, the wind carried a tension that seemed to warn him. The stranger wasn't here by chance, and the filly's past wasn't as far behind her as he had hoped. The cowboy stood a few feet from the gate, studying the stranger's posture, the way he held himself too still, as if he was waiting for the smallest slip. The man had a stiff jaw and eyes that moved quicker than his words. There was a kind of sharpness in his stare that made the cowboy pause before answering. He kept his tone even when he spoke, telling the stranger he had bought a young filly, though he left out the details. The man nodded slowly, almost like the cowboy had confirmed something he already suspected. The stranger said he had been looking for a horse that fit the filly's description and claimed she had once belonged to someone he knew. He didn't say how she ended up in that condition, and the cowboy noticed he carefully avoided that part. A breeze passed between them, carrying dust and a faint whistle from the open fields. The cowboy didn't move from where he stood, keeping a respectful distance but not giving an inch. The stranger asked if he could see the horse, but something in his voice felt off. There was a push in it, a weight behind the words that didn't match simple concern. The cowboy answered politely but firmly, saying the filly needed rest and wasn't up for visitors yet. The stranger's jaw tightened, and he pushed his hat a little lower against the sun as if thinking through his next move. He didn't argue, though. Instead, he gave a dry smile that didn't reach his eyes and said he might return in a few days to check again. Before leaving, he glanced toward the barn with a strange kind of interest that made the cowboy fold his arms. The man walked back to his truck, got in, and drove away without another word. The cowboy watched the dust trail stretch behind him until it faded into the morning light. Something about that visit gnawed at him. Anyone could ask about a horse, but the stranger's tone held a hint of ownership mixed with warning. It made the air heavier, like a shifting storm that hadn't fully arrived. He went back into the barn to check on the filly. She stood near the water bucket, her ears turned toward the door as if she had sensed the conversation. When he stepped inside, she relaxed slightly. He spoke softly to her, running a hand along her neck. She still flinched a little, but not as much as before. He wondered what she had been through. Horses didn't lose trust without a reason. Fear like hers came from something deeper, something learned. For the next few days, he followed a routine with her. He gave her small meals spread throughout the day so her weak body could handle them. He brushed her coat until it started to shine, and he kept her stall warm during the colder nights. He didn't rush her training or try to push her into anything too soon. Every improvement she showed came at her own pace. She began lifting her head more, listening to the sounds outside the barn, watching the dog trot around with interest instead of fear. All those little changes mattered. He also noticed something about her eyes. At first, they held nothing but worry, but as time passed, there was a glimmer that hinted at a strong spirit buried underneath. She wasn't just a weak young filly. She was trying to recover who she once was. The cowboy found himself spending more time than he expected sitting on an old crate by her stall, watching her eat or rest. He couldn't shake the thought that she might have more value than anyone realized, not just in terms of money, but in something more important. Despite the peaceful routines, the memory of the stranger's visit lingered. Every time the cowboy walked the fence line or fed the cattle, he found himself glancing toward the road. The stranger had said he might come back. Nothing about that sentence felt casual. The cowboy didn't like unanswered questions, especially when they involved a horse now under his care. The filly clearly had a past, one that didn't match her quiet nature. He kept thinking about the marks he saw on her legs, the way she recoiled at sudden movements, and the weak condition she arrived in. Someone had done wrong by her, and the stranger's tense presence didn't ease the weight of that suspicion. One afternoon, while he cleaned the filly's stall, an old friend from town stopped by to drop off some supplies. They talked casually for a while, and the cowboy mentioned he had bought a young horse at the sale yard. His friend asked to take a look, so they walked to the barn together. When his friend saw the filly, he let out a low whistle, surprised by her condition but impressed by her calm eyes. After a moment of studying her, he said she looked like the kind of horse that came from a long line of strong bloodlines. He couldn't be sure, but her build hinted at something beyond an ordinary sale yard find. That comment stuck with the cowboy long after his friend drove away. Later that evening, as the sky shifted into streaks of pink and orange, the cowboy led the filly out of the stall for a short walk. She followed him slowly but willingly. He kept the rope loose, giving her space. The open yard stretched out around them, quiet except for the crickets starting to hum. She sniffed the ground and looked around with cautious interest. The setting sun cast long shadows across the land, making everything feel still. The cowboy watched her movements, noticing how she tried to hide the slight limp in her step. Whatever injury she had must have been healing, but it wasn't gone yet. He turned her gently toward the barn when he spotted a faint dust trail in the distance, rising from the direction of the main road. His chest tightened. He stood still, watching the thin line of dust grow thicker. A vehicle was definitely heading his way. He didn't want to risk the filly getting startled, so he calmly led her inside and closed the stall door before stepping outside again. The truck rolled to a stop near the gate. It wasn't the same one as before, but that didn't make him relax. Two men stepped out this time. Their hats were pulled low, and their boots looked like they had spent too many hours in places where trouble lingered. The cowboy walked toward them, not rushing, not hesitating. The men nodded in greeting. One of them asked if he owned the filly from the sale yard. His tone wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't friendly either. It had the practiced smoothness of someone used to hiding intention. The cowboy kept his reply simple. Yes, he had bought her. No, she wasn't for sale. The men exchanged a quick glance. One asked if he had paperwork for her. The cowboy replied that whoever owned her before the sale hadn't left much behind. The men didn't comment, but their eyes sharpened. They stayed quiet for a moment, as if waiting for him to reveal something more. When he didn't, they said they were leaving and walked back to their truck. Before getting in, one of them paused and said something that stirred the unease inside the cowboy even deeper. He said the filly wasn't just any horse, and some folks might come looking for her whether he agreed or not. It wasn't a threat, not directly, but it felt too close to one. After they left, the cowboy checked the locks on the barn, even though he had never bothered with them before. The sky grew dark, and a restless feeling sat heavy in his mind. The filly was quiet in her stall, unaware of the tension outside. He leaned on the stall door, watching her. He had bought her without knowing anything about her past, and now strangers were appearing who seemed to know too much. As the night settled in, the ranch felt different. The open land that usually brought comfort now carried a sense of watchfulness. The cowboy stayed awake longer than usual, listening to the wind brush against the barn walls. He couldn't shake the feeling that something about the filly's past was tied to people who weren't done looking for her. And whatever they wanted wasn't going to be simple. He knew things were shifting, building, tightening like a rope pulled between two strong hands. The filly's arrival had opened a door he hadn't meant to step through. And even though he didn't understand the full story yet, he could sense that the real conflict was only just beginning. The longer the filly stayed on the ranch, the more the cowboy realized he had stepped into something far bigger than a simple bargain at the sale yard. It started with small changes. A soft nicker when she saw him near the fence, the way her ears perked toward his footsteps, the steady way she tried to match his pace even when her legs trembled. It was slow progress, uneven at times, but it held a kind of promise he couldn't ignore. Each day he felt pulled deeper into a bond he hadn't expected to form, not with a horse as broken and overlooked as her. Yet something about her spirit, faint but steady, hinted at a story she carried long before he showed up with coins in his pocket. He often worked with horses, but this one forced him to rethink everything he thought he knew. She had moments where she moved like a ghost, too quiet, too careful, as if she feared her own shadow. Other times she jerked her head high and watched the horizon with a strange certainty, like she was waiting for something or someone. The cowboy noticed these shifts and it unsettled him. He told himself it didn't matter. A horse was a horse. But he knew deep down she wasn't simple. She wasn't predictable. And the more he watched her, the more questions he had. Rumors about her old owner drifted to him when he wasn't even trying to listen. Folks claimed the man who sold her had once prided himself on breeding strong horses. They said drought had ruined his land, sickness had swept through his herd, and hardship had carved the line between his good days and bad. Some whispered that the filly had been his last hope before he gave up. Others claimed she wasn't born weak, that something had happened to her, something no one had talked about openly. When these stories reached the cowboy, he wondered which version held the truth. He didn't care much for gossip, yet he found himself piecing together each detail like clues to a hidden map. One afternoon, as the sun leaned low and cast long shadows across the pasture, he caught her staring at the far ridge. It wasn't unusual for horses to watch the horizon, but something about the intensity in her eyes made him freeze. She wasn't scanning for danger or reacting to a sound. She was remembering something. He walked toward her slowly, boots pressing into the dry grass with steady rhythm. She didn't flinch, didn't turn her head. She just kept looking, steady and sure, until he raised a hand and brushed her neck. "You're seeing something, aren't you?" he whispered. She let out a breath, a deep, shaky one, and leaned the slightest bit into his hand. He had no way of knowing what went through her mind, but the moment felt heavier than the quiet around them. It felt like she was asking him to trust her, even if she couldn't explain why. The ranch itself was changing too. His family noticed the late nights, the early mornings, and the silent focus he carried now. He didn't talk about the filly much, not because he wanted to keep her a secret, but because he didn't know what to say. How did a man explain that a horse barely strong enough to trot, was somehow reshaping the rhythm of his life. How did he explain the odd calm he felt whenever she stood close, or the tension that gripped his chest when she seemed lost in memories he couldn't see? There was a day when the weather turned rough and the wind rolled across the land like a warning. He hurried to secure the barn, but when he reached her stall, she stood pressed against the gate, trembling harder than she had since the day he brought her home. The wind wasn't loud enough to frighten most horses, yet she acted like something unseen had slipped into the air. The cowboy spoke softly, ran his hand along her muzzle, and waited for her breathing to steady. When she finally calmed, he felt his own heartbeat settle. There was something unspoken passing between them, something he wasn't fully ready to name. She trusted him, and he wasn't sure he deserved it. Later that night he sat by the table sipping warm coffee while the storm tapped at the windows. His father sat across from him, studying him with the steady gaze of a man who'd lived long enough to read the truth without hearing it. After a long silence, the older man set his cup down and shook his head. "You keep thinking about that filly," he said. "Like she's carrying a story you can't quite reach." The cowboy didn't deny it. His father wasn't wrong. He took a slow breath before speaking. "She's different. I don't know how to say it." "You don't have to," his father replied. "Some horses come with history, some come with warning, and some come with purpose. You just have to figure which one she is." The words stuck with the cowboy long, after his father had gone to bed. Purpose? Did the filly truly have one, or was he making something out of nothing? He looked out the window toward the barn, knowing she stood there awake even in the late hour. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was waiting for something bigger than either of them understood. As the weeks rolled on, she grew stronger. Her steps steadied, her coat gained shine, and her eyes held more life than the day he bought her. But as her strength returned, so did her unpredictability. Some days she trained smoothly, following cues with surprising precision. Other days she refused to move forward, staring toward that same distant ridge, her ears pinned with unease. The tension between progress and setback kept the cowboy on edge. He couldn't force her to forget whatever lay in her past, but he needed her to face forward if she was going to survive here. A stranger arrived one afternoon, riding into the ranch with dust on his boots and a quiet seriousness around him. He claimed to be passing through, looking for work or information. But when his eyes landed on the filly in the pasture, something flickered across his face. Recognition. It was faint, quick, but the cowboy caught it. The stranger asked too many questions after that. Asked about where the horse came from, how much she'd been eating, whether she'd shown signs of fear or defiance. The cowboy answered carefully, kept his guard high. He didn't know why, but something about the man felt wrong. It felt dangerous. When the stranger finally rode off, the filly paced the fence for a long while, restless and uneasy. The cowboy watched her move, watched the worry in her gait, and felt the knots in his chest tighten. Whatever past she carried, it was no longer distant, it was approaching. And whoever that man was, he wasn't done with her. That night, as the sky dimmed and the quiet settled thick across the ranch, the cowboy walked out to the barn to check on her. She lifted her head the moment she heard him, eyes wide, as if hoping he could explain the strange shift she felt in the world around them. He didn't have the answers. He only had the growing sense that the filly's story was about to collide with his own future in ways he never expected. And as he stepped into her stall, he realized the real conflict was stirring now. Not behind them, but ahead. The days after the stranger's visit moved with a strange heaviness, as if the ranch itself sensed something shifting in the air. The cowboy stayed alert, watching the ridge more often, checking the gates twice, listening to the slightest echo of hoofbeats that didn't belong. The filly picked up on his tension too. She stuck close to him whenever he entered the pasture, following him with quiet steps, not wanting to stray too far. Her trust had grown stronger, but so had her fear. She seemed to know trouble was drawing near, even if she couldn't show him what shape it would take. He tried to keep the routine steady. Morning feed, brushing her coat until the dust fell loose, guiding her through basic exercises to keep her mind working. But even simple things felt different now. When he lifted the lead rope, her ears twitched in a worried angle. When he guided her in circles, she kept glancing toward the ridge. When the wind pushed across the land, she stiffened before relaxing again. These small signs gathered like storm clouds he couldn't ignore. One afternoon, while training her near the corral, she halted mid-step and locked her gaze on the distance. Her muscles tightened, and for a moment she seemed caught between running and freezing. The cowboy followed her stare, but the land ahead looked empty, only tall grass swaying under the sun. Still, the air carried a faint sense of warning. He slowly lowered the rope, letting her stand still until her breathing softened again. She was trying to tell him something. He just didn't know how to read it fully. Inside the ranch house, the family felt the shift too. His father mentioned seeing fresh tracks near the creek, ones that didn't match their livestock. His younger brother claimed he spotted someone riding near the far boundary in the early morning, though he wasn't certain. These bits of information gathered in the cowboy's mind like pieces of a larger truth forming in the dark. Someone was coming back for the filly. Or maybe they never left. Maybe they had been watching all along. He didn't want to alarm anyone more than necessary, so he kept quiet about the stranger's lingering look. But deep down, he suspected the man would return. There was something unfinished in the way he had asked questions, something that felt too exact to be casual curiosity. The cowboy kept replaying the brief moment when the stranger's eyes had met the filly's. It had been quick, but not cold. It had been something else, something like recognition mixed with regret, and that bothered him more than anger ever could. As the weather warmed and the evening stretched longer, the cowboy started training the filly farther from the barn, hoping the open space would help her settle. Her steps had grown steadier, her stride longer, as she followed commands more easily. She had strength now, real strength, not the fragile kind she carried when he first brought her home. Still, she remained cautious, reacting to distant sounds faster than most horses her age. Sometimes she lifted her head sharply at noises too faint for him to hear. Other times she froze, staring into shadows without moving a muscle. One evening, while the sun lowered behind the hills, he decided to take her beyond the pasture for a longer walk. He saddled her lightly, not wanting to push her too hard, and guided her down the narrow trail that wound along the creek. The water shimmered beside them, reflecting the orange sky. At first, she moved with careful curiosity, ears flicking as she took in new sights, but halfway down the trail she stopped. Her body tightened, breath quickened, and she angled her head toward the thicket across the water. The cowboy scanned the brush but saw nothing but branches and fading light. Yet the filly refused to take another step. He dismounted and placed a calming hand on her neck. She swallowed hard as if trying to push back a memory rising like smoke. He stayed with her until she softened enough to turn around. They headed back to the ranch quietly, his boots crunching on the dirt and her hooves tapping with an uneven cadence. Whatever she sensed wasn't far, and the cowboy felt the truth settling into him with a weight he couldn't shake. The unease followed him through the night. He lay awake long after the lamps were blown out, replaying each small sign she'd shown. He pictured the stranger's shadow stretching at the edge of the property. He imagined what history she had carried from the home she'd been taken from. And somewhere inside him, a protective instinct rose stronger than before. He didn't just want to help her heal anymore. He wanted to shield her from whatever or whoever haunted her steps. The next morning, a fresh set of hoofprints appeared near the east fence line. They were shallow but clear enough for a skilled rider to recognize. Someone had circled the property, keeping distance but paying attention. The cowboy studied the tracks quietly, his jaw tightening as his father approached. "Someone's been watching," his father said, voice low. "I know," the cowboy replied. His father gave him a long look. "This about that filly?" The cowboy nodded, though the answer came heavy. He didn't know why anyone would go to such lengths for a horse that had been sold for nearly nothing. Unless she wasn't meant to be sold, unless she had been taken by mistake or out of desperation, or unless someone realized too late what she was worth. That thought made his pulse beat harder. Later that day, as he brushed the filly in the quiet barn, she shifted uncomfortably, bumping his arm with her warm breath. He paused and looked at her closely. Her eyes were soft, searching him as if she sensed the worry burning under his calm surface. He rested his hand on her cheek and held it there. For the first time since he'd brought her home, he felt truly afraid of what might come next. He tried to focus on training again, hoping to ground himself. He led her into the round pen and worked on simple commands. But before long she stopped responding, her attention fixed on the ridge again. Her ears angled forward with a sharper focus than before. This time she wasn't just curious or uncertain. She was preparing. She was bracing herself. The cowboy followed her stare and felt a chill roll through him. He couldn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched tightened the air. The wind stilled, carrying the faintest shift of scent from far away. Something in that moment told him the stranger wasn't just passing through anymore. The man was close. And he wasn't coming alone. Determined not to be caught off guard, the cowboy started planning. He checked every gate and latch. He reinforced weak boards along the corral. He kept his horse saddled longer than usual, ready in case he needed to ride fast. The filly stayed restless, pacing in her stall, backing away when shadows moved too fast, standing alert through the night. That evening, his father gathered the family at the table, speaking in a tone they rarely heard. "Whatever's coming, it's tied to that horse," he said. "We need to be ready." The cowboy swallowed hard. He didn't want to fight. He didn't want trouble on his family's land. But he also wasn't willing to hand over a filly who had fought so hard to trust him. The thought of losing her now hit him deeper than he expected. As darkness settled across the ranch, the air grew colder than usual. The fields lay quiet. The wind barely touched the grass. It was the kind of stillness that felt unnatural, like the land was holding its breath. The cowboy stepped out onto the porch, scanning the horizon carefully. Far off, at the edge of the ridge, he spotted a flicker of movement. It was small, almost hidden by the tall grass, but unmistakable. A rider, then another, moving slow, watching the ranch the way a wolf watches a herd. The cowboy's heart thudded hard against his ribs. He backed into the house, grabbed his coat, and headed toward the barn. The filly was already standing at the gate, muscles tight, eyes wide as if she knew they were coming for her. And as he reached for her halter, a sound echoed faintly through the night. Hoofbeats. Steady, growing closer. The kind that signaled the moment just before everything changed. The real threat was no longer hidden. It was on its way. The cowboy tightened his grip on the filly's halter as the hoofbeats echoed louder across the field. The sound carried a kind of finality, like the moment he had been bracing for had finally stepped out of the shadows. The filly pressed her head against his arm, trembling, but not in the same way she once had. This time it wasn't pure fear, it was recognition. She knew exactly who was riding in, and she wanted no part of it. He led her out of the barn and stood in the open yard. He didn't hide from the riders or wait inside for them to make the first move. If they had come for her, they could face him out in the open where nothing could twist truth into shadows. The moon cast a pale glow across the land, enough for him to see the two figures approaching. One rode tall in the saddle, the same stranger he'd met weeks before. The second rider moved behind him slowly, like they didn't entirely agree with the decision to come. The riders halted several yards away. The stranger lifted a hand as a sign he wasn't here to start trouble. His voice carried across the open space with a calmness that didn't match the tension in the air. "I came to speak," he called out. "Only speak." The cowboy didn't loosen his stance. "Then speak from where you are," he replied. The filly nudged closer to him, her breath warm against his sleeve. She kept her eyes locked on the stranger with a mix of fear and old memory. The cowboy felt her worry climbing through her muscles, and he laid a grounding hand on her neck. The stranger exhaled slowly. "She wasn't meant to be at that sale," he said. "And she wasn't sold for the coins you paid. Someone made decisions they shouldn't have made." "Bad ones," the cowboy didn't answer. He wanted the truth to come out on its own terms. He kept his eyes fixed on the riders, watching every shift of their posture. The stranger continued, his voice lower now. "Her previous owner ran into trouble. The kind that forces a man to part with things he never meant to lose. I was sent to track her down. I didn't expect to find her here. I didn't expect to find her alive and recovering." His tone softened. "You've done more for her than anyone before." The cowboy felt the filly lean her weight against him, as if confirming those words. He steadied her and finally spoke. "What do you want now?" The stranger hesitated before answering. "To take her back," he said. "But not by force, not by fear, I came to ask. And to tell you the truth she deserves. The cowboy looked down at the filly. Her eyes held the same question he felt inside himself. Was returning with them the right thing for her? Or was staying here the life she truly needed? The answer wasn't simple. The second rider shifted forward slightly, lowering their voice. "She's from a line of strong runners," they said. "She was meant for more than being pushed and broken down. She needed care. She needed time. We didn't give it." "But you did." Those words hit deeper than the cowboy expected. He could sense no threat behind them, only regret. The filly lifted her head, watching the speakers with careful attention. He released a long breath. "If she goes back, will she be safe?" The stranger nodded. "She will. The man who once handled her isn't part of the picture anymore. The mess that led her to that sale is gone now." Silence settled between them for a long moment. The cowboy looked at the filly again. She glanced from him to the riders, but her body stayed angled toward him. Her choice wasn't hidden. She had grown here, healed here, and learned trust here. What she wanted was written in her posture. He stroked her neck gently before speaking again. "She chooses where she goes," he said. "Not me, not you." The stranger watched quietly before giving a slow nod. "Then ask her," he said. The cowboy loosened the halter rope and stepped back a few feet. The filly blinked and flicked her ears, confused at first by the space he offered. She looked at him, then at the riders waiting in the distance. The night felt heavier with her silence than with any words spoken so far. After a pause, she took a few steps toward the riders. The cowboy felt his chest tighten, but he didn't call her back. She had earned the right to choose freely. She walked halfway across the open space, then suddenly stopped. Her ears angled sharply, and she looked back at the cowboy, not with fear, but with clarity. She turned around fully and walked right back to him. Her steps were steady and sure, carrying a choice she didn't need words to explain. She nudged her head into his chest, settling her weight against him in a final answer. The riders watched silently. The stranger closed his eyes for a moment before nodding in acceptance. "Then she stays," he said. "And that's the end of it." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "This is her record. Everything about her past. Everything she came from. It's yours now." He set it on the ground and backed away. The cowboy didn't move until the two riders turned their horses and headed back into the night. They didn't rush. They didn't linger. They simply rode off, accepting what they could not change. When their silhouettes disappeared over the ridge, the cowboy knelt beside the filly. She lowered her head to his shoulder, breathing slow again. The ranch was quiet, as if the land itself had settled now that the truth was out. He picked up the paper but didn't open it yet. The past wasn't as important as the future she now had. Still, he tucked it into his coat for when the moment felt right. They walked back toward the barn together, the tension that had filled the air for days finally breaking apart. The filly moved beside him with a calm confidence he hadn't seen in her before. She wasn't a weak, lost horse anymore. She wasn't running from bad memories. She wasn't waiting for someone to reclaim what she'd become. She was choosing her own place. A place where healing had turned into hope. A place that felt steady beneath her hooves. In the weeks that followed, her training grew stronger. Her stride lengthened, her spirit settled. She worked alongside the cowboy with a new sense of purpose, as if she finally understood she wasn't just surviving now. She was building something with him. The cowboy felt the change too. Buying her for almost nothing had seemed like a simple choice back then, a quick decision made in a dusty pen. Yet it had turned into the most important turn his life had taken. She had taught him patience, trust, and a deeper understanding of how healing works, not just for animals but for people too. One evening, months later, the cowboy stood at the fence while the sun settled across the open land. The filly, no longer frail or uncertain, ran freely through the pasture. Her coat shone in the light, her stride powerful and smooth. She lifted her head toward him, releasing a soft call that carried across the quiet field. He smiled, knowing the truth he hadn't spoken aloud. She hadn't just changed his daily work or the routine of the ranch. She had changed his direction, shaped his heart, and turned one small choice into a future he hadn't expected. The weak young filly he purchased for almost nothing had become everything he didn't know he needed. And as she ran with strength and grace, the cowboy understood the real meaning behind her journey. Sometimes the greatest changes come from the smallest, most unlikely beginnings. Sometimes hope arrives in a fragile form, asking only for a chance. And when that chance is given, it can rewrite a life. Their future stretched open before them, steady and bright. The past was behind them, the fear was gone. What remained was simple and strong, a cowboy, a filly, and a bond that would carry them farther than either of them had ever imagined.